Thumbnail sketches are those small, rough drawings that help me map out my ideas before diving into more detailed drawings. They're like the blueprint for my artwork, allowing me to experiment with different compositions, perspectives, and layouts without getting bogged down by the details. By starting with thumbnails, I can quickly test out ideas and figure out what works best before committing to a final piece. In this video, I want to help you recognize and avoid some common mistakes that can pop up during the thumbnail sketching process. By addressing these issues, you'll be able to use thumbnails more effectively and improve your overall workflow. One of the biggest mistakes I've made, and I see others make, is jumping straight into a thumbnail sketch without thinking about composition first. It's so easy to get excited about an idea and dive right in, but without a plan, the drawing can quickly feel unbalanced or chaotic. When I don't take time to think through the layout, I often end up with something that doesn't quite work when it's time to create the final piece. The solution? Take a step back and spend a few moments mapping out the basic layouts of your elements before you start drawing. This doesn't have to be complicated. I like to use simple shapes of whatever it is I'm drawing, whatever my idea involves, to block in where the major elements will go. It helps me to see how everything will fit together on the page and whether the composition feels dynamic or balanced. This small step can make a huge difference in the overall flow of your piece and save you from headaches down the road when you move to the next stage of drawing. By thinking about composition early on, you're giving yourself a clear direction, and it'll be much easier to make adjustments or refine the piece later. Another common mistake I've fallen into is getting overly focused on the details too early in the process. It's tempting to start refining little parts of a thumbnail sketch, especially when you're excited about a particular idea, but the whole point of thumbnails is to keep things simple and fast. When I get too wrapped up in the details, I lose the fluidity of the sketch and it ends up taking way longer than it should, defeating the purpose of thumbnailing in the first place. The key here is to remind yourself that thumbnails are just rough drafts. They're meant to capture the overall idea and composition, not the fine details. I like to focus on the general shapes, movement, and flow of the piece. If I start adding too much detail, I'll pause and ask myself, am I losing sight of the big picture? And if the answer is yes, I'll step back and simplify things. Keeping your thumbnails loose allows you to quickly test out different ideas without getting bogged down. You'll save the details for later when you're working on the final piece. The goal is to stay flexible and let the creative process flow, not to perfect every tiny aspect in the early stages. So keep it simple and trust that the details will come together when it's time. The next common mistake is ignoring proportions, and I've definitely been guilty of this one. Ignoring proportions when working on thumbnail sketches, it's easy to overlook, especially since thumbnails are meant to be quick and rough. But when I don't pay attention to proportions in the early stages, I often end up running into problems later on when I start refining the piece. Elements might feel too big or small, and adjusting them after the fact can be frustrating. Learn that it's essential to consider proportions, even in my roughest thumbnails. You don't need to be exact, but having a basic sense of scale can save you a lot of time and headaches later on. I usually start by sketching a light framework with rough guidelines for key elements, figures, objects, animals, landscape elements. This helps me keep everything in balance and makes the final transition from thumbnail to full-size drawing much smoother. By paying attention to proportions in your thumbnails, you're laying a solid foundation for your final piece. It doesn't have to be perfect, but getting the scale right in the early stages will make everything feel more cohesive and realistic when you flesh out the details. Plus, it'll save you from having to make major corrections later. One of the mistakes I used to make was drawing my thumbnails either way too large or far too small. When thumbnails are too big, they defeat the whole purpose of being quick and simple because I'd start adding unnecessary details. On the flip side, when they're too small, I'd struggle to get a clear sense of the composition or any of the essential elements. It's like trying to squeeze a full scene onto a postage stamp. The sweet spot is somewhere in between. I've found that sticking to a size around 1 to 2 inches helps me capture the idea without getting bogged down in detail. It's just big enough to see the overall flow and composition, but small enough that it forces me to keep things simple. By working at this size, I can easily sketch out multiple thumbnails in a short amount of time and compare them side by side. Finding the right size for your thumbnails is all about striking a balance between clarity and simplicity. Keeping them manageable allows you to focus on the big picture and quickly experiment with different ideas. This way, you won't lose track of the primary purpose of thumbnailing, getting ideas down fast without overthinking it. Early on, I'd often find myself sticking to safe, static poses and predictable perspectives in my thumbnail sketches. It's easy to fall into the habit of drawing what feels comfortable, but that can lead to stiff compositions that lack energy and movement. When everything feels rigid, it limits the creativity of the final piece. The solution is to treat your thumbnails like a playground for experimentation. This is the perfect time to try out bold poses, exaggerated angles, and new perspectives. I remind myself that these sketches aren't final, they're for testing ideas. Don't be afraid to push the boundaries a bit and explore perspectives that may feel a little outside your comfort zone. You might be surprised by how much energy it can add to a piece when you tilt the camera or perspective or give a character a more dynamic pose. Thumbnails are the best place to be fearless with your ideas. By letting go of these needs for everything to look polished and perfect, you open yourself up to discovering compositions that feel alive and full of movement. Even if some experiments don't work, it's all part of the process of finding the best version of your concept. For a long time, I used to ignore value and contrast in my thumbnail sketches, thinking they weren't really necessary at that stage. But I quickly learned that without even a rough sense of light and shadow, my thumbnails lacked depth and often ended up feeling flat. The problem is when I moved to a more detailed version of a drawing, I found myself struggling to figure out how the light would interact with the elements in the composition, which made the process way harder than it needed to be. To fix this, I started adding simple shading and value blocks to my thumbnails. Nothing fancy, just a few rough indications of where the light is coming from and where the shadows fall. This helps me visualize the depth and contrast early on and makes sure that composition doesn't feel too one-dimensional. It also gives me a better sense of where the focal points will be, guiding the viewer's eye naturally across the piece. By paying attention to value and contrast, even in the early thumbnail stage, you'll end up with a much stronger composition that's easier to develop later. Plus, it gives your thumbnails more life, making it easier to imagine how the final piece will look once you start adding details and refining your work. One mistake I've definitely struggled with is overcrowding my thumbnails by trying to cram too many elements into the composition. It's tempting to want to include every idea or detail, especially when you're excited about a concept. But in thumbnail sketches, this can lead to cluttered, overwhelming designs. When everything is fighting for attention, the composition ends up looking chaotic and the main idea gets lost. The solution I found is to simplify. Thumbnails are all about capturing the essence of your idea. Not every single detail So focus on the key elements that will drive the composition and let go of unnecessary clutter. I'll ask myself, what's the focal point? What's the most important part of this composition here? And build the sketch around that. By reducing the number of elements, I can ensure that the composition feels balanced and has a clear visual hierarchy. By simplifying and avoiding overcrowding, your thumbnails will feel cleaner, more impactful, and much easier to expand into a final piece. It's about letting go of the urge to include everything and trusting that a strong composition will speak louder than one that's overstuffed with detail. I often made the mistake of sketching one thumbnail and assuming it was the best version of my idea. I'd get attached to the first sketch and move forward without exploring other options. The problem with this approach is that it limits your creativity and doesn't give you the opportunity to find a potentially better composition. Sometimes the first idea isn't always the strongest. And what I've learned is the value of creating multiple thumbnails for each idea. I now try to sketch at least 3 variations, even if I feel confident about the first one. By doing this, I allow myself to experiment with different compositions, perspectives, or even focal points. This process often reveals options I hadn't considered and gives me the chance to compare and choose the best version. Creating several thumbnails also takes the pressure off the first one, so I'm not as attached to it and can be more open to making changes. Exploring multiple options ensures that you're not settling for the first thing that comes to mind, and it gives you more flexibility to refine and improve your concept. It's all about staying open to the different possibilities and giving your ideas room to grow. For a long time, I'd sketch out my thumbnails and move on without really taking the time to analyze or revise them. I thought, they're just rough ideas, so why spend more time on them? But over time, I realized that skipping this step often led to issues down the line. Problems with composition, balance, or flow that could have been caught early on. Now I make it a habit to pause and review my thumbnails before moving forward. I'll step back and look at them with fresh eyes, maybe a few hours later or the next day, and ask myself, does this composition work? Is the focal point clear? Are there any awkward areas? If someone knew nothing about my idea, would this make sense to them? And if something feels off, I'll go back and make adjustments, whether it's reworking the layout or combining elements from different thumbnails or reworking a sequence if it's a storyboard. This extra bit of analysis and revision helps me catch potential issues early, so they don't become bigger problems when I'm deeper into the drawing process. By taking the time to refine your thumbnails, you're setting yourself up for success in the later stages, and you'll have a stronger foundation to build on. Don't rush past this step. Sometimes the smallest tweaks can make the biggest difference. And the last mistake I'm going to talk about is one mistake I've caught myself making, and that is sticking to the same format or aspect ratio for every single thumbnail. Whether it's always working in a horizontal layout or using the same square format, this can limit creativity and keep you from exploring new possibilities. When I get too comfortable with a specific format, my compositions can start to feel repetitive and predictable. I'll even start drawings the same way or at the same part of the thumbnail. And the fix is to mix things up. I've started experimenting with different formats, horizontal, vertical, panoramic, or even odd shapes. Each format brings a new challenge and can totally change the feel of a composition. For example, a tall vertical thumbnail might highlight the height of a mountain or a character's posture, while a wide horizontal format can emphasize a landscape or a sense of movement and flow, like in a story sequence. By switching up the aspect ratio, I often discover new ways to frame a scene that I wouldn't have thought of otherwise. Playing around with different formats opens up more creative possibilities and prevents your work from feeling stale. Thumbnails are the perfect place to try these variations, giving you the freedom to experiment before committing to a final composition. And it's amazing how much of an impact simply changing the format can have on the overall energy of a piece. Thumbnail sketching is such a powerful tool, and it's something that has completely transformed the way I approach my art. By recognizing and addressing common mistakes, whether it's not planning the composition, getting stuck on the details, or sticking to just one thumbnail, you can really streamline your process and open up more creative possibilities. Thumbnails aren't just rough drafts, there's space for experimentation, exploration, and refinement. By avoiding these pitfalls and making small adjustments to your approach, you'll find that the thumbnails that you're making become a more effective foundation for your final pieces. Remember, the whole point is to explore ideas quickly and without pressure. So embrace the process, stay flexible, and have fun with it. The more you practice, the easier it becomes to avoid these common mistakes and make your thumbnails work for you. I hope you liked this video. If you did, please hit the thumbs up. And if you want to see more videos like this, please subscribe to my channel. Thanks.